Hey guys, welcome to something pretty new. Um, Final Fantasy 15, Dawn of the Future. Um, I have read things before to my friends, um, but not publicly like this, and not where it's going to go up on YouTube. So I am a very quick reader. I read fast. I taught myself to read at a young age, and I read very quickly. So me stumbling over words is going to be a thing, and I might need to restart a couple of sentences. I'm sorry, it just happens. um, so I apologize in advance for that. But yes, Dawn of the Future contains 4 DLCs featuring these 4 characters on screen. That and it's essentially a shell of what the vision that Tabata had. And so I was able to, because they're not made readily available online, I was able to take some scans from a Kindle version that I bought. So I have 2 versions of Dawn of the Future. My hardback right here that I pre-ordered, and the Kindle version, which has the concept art and colored pictures, and I took some relevant ones, and those are going to be your visuals. The visuals dwindle as we go through the episodes, but we're going to be starting off with a familiar one that we just finished watching, episode Ardyn. It does add a little bit more. I vaguely tried to keep things in order. Hello, geese. Do you want to be in on this? You can't be in on this. There were actual geese outside my house. So, we're going to start with episode Ardyn. Whoop! And that is the cover art for episode Ardyn. A lot of this is concept art, and it is beautiful. And I will say, like, I read, like, a critique of Dawn of the Future, just, like, I skimmed it, and a lot of things were like they use repetitive phrasing, and I'm like, well, yeah, it's a video game book. Generally they're not super duper excellent, but and one was like the action scenes feel dull, and I'm like, well, it's hard to write action scenes. As someone who writes for a living, it's very difficult to write action scenes, so I don't really blame them. And I didn't think that they were that dull. Some of them I was on the edge of my seat for. So, but I mean, it's definitely got its moments where even I was like, this is kind of dumb, or like, that's not right. But like, I very much enjoy this, and I'm looking forward to reading this to you guys. So there are 4 chapters in total, but each chapter is essentially each DLC. So we're just going to make our way through the best we can until it's all done, because this book, the story ends at page... The story ends at page... I swear to God. At 376/77. So, we've got a hike ahead of us. Let's begin. So, episode Ardyn is unofficially titled A Savior Lost. Hear that page turning action? Okay. ME Modern Era 756. The flurry of footfalls echoing along the cold catwalk came to an abrupt halt. A momentary shudder passed through the runner, who now stood before the sacred stone, bathed in its icy light. His black hair was shaggy, left to grow in any and every direction at will, and his shoulders hung slightly rounded, as if hinting at some wayward nature. His breathing was labored, heavy after his headlong sprint. Please, help me stop the demons. The words seemed rent from the boy's throat, his voice ragged. He reached out to touch the stone, but no sooner were his fingertips upon it than his desperate plea contorted into an anguished cry. There's our first fuck up with me. The crystal began to pull him in. His expression was frozen in shock. The boy's observer drew close from behind, struggling to suppress a smile. Unharmed by light, the chosen king indeed. The young scion was still so lacking. He was little more than a copycat of proper royalty, really. Yet the crystal did not deny him. It was an irritating reality, further driven home when the boy turned to identify the voice coming from behind him. Oh, how familiar were the contours of that face. His was the very countenance of that ancient false king, never meant for the throne, but drawing power from the crystal nonetheless. "Allow me to regale you with a tale," the observer said, offering a glimpse of history like scraps tossed to a dog. In an age long past, an incurable scourge ravaged mankind. A tiny menace that twisted men into monsters, the likes of which you've never seen. The boy's eyes revealed of how little he knew of the world. As the story began, a flicker of uncertainty flashed across them, but they quickly narrowed. "Good. Let the anger flow. Let it run unchecked. Wrap yourself in rage and gnash your teeth as you learn how powerless you truly are. In Lucis lived a savior that could cure the afflicted. His body would come to host a myriad of demons, that countless lives be spared." "Thank you." Without warning, long-forgotten voices echoed in the observer's mind. It was joined by another, this one choked with tears. "Oh, thank the gods, I'm my old self again." Then more. "Lord Caelum, you have saved me. Without your mercy, my lord, I would have surely remained a hideous monster, struck down by the soldiers of our land. It is only because of your kindness that I stand here today." The observer shook his head slightly to dispel the flood. He'd presumed such words had been lost to time. And what of it, he thought. That chapter has long since drawn to its close. Should remnants linger, they are of no value or meaning to me. He smoothly resumed his tale, inner conflict unbetrayed by outward sign. But a jealous king, one not yet chosen by the crystal, ostracized and demonized this healer of the people, making a true monster of him. And here the observer could no longer suppress his smile. The corners of his mouth curled up of their own accord, curved daggers that pierced through all the insufferable bitterness and aggravation that had plagued his life. "I gave you my name earlier, but you should know it was not the name given to me at birth." All those who knew his true identity had long since departed this world. He was now known as Ardyn Lucis, Imperial Chancellor of Niflheim. "Ardyn Lucis Caelum is my proper name." On speaking his own name for the first time in ages, Ardyn was surprised by the potency of hatred that surged within him. He'd taken it for granted, numb to its constant, unwavering presence. Yet there it still writhed, that almost forgotten intensity blacker than darkness itself. Prince Noctis. His lips began to form the boy's name. He paused, then opted for a more familiar address. Noct. The boy's nickname. Uttering it spread a deliciously sinister warmth through him. "Killing you as a mortal will bring me scant satisfaction. Claim the crystal's power. Arise as its champion." This was whom the crystal had chosen those 15 years ago. Here was the young king who, with the power of stone in hand, assumed the task of banishing the darkness as calamity descended upon the world. "Once the crystal and king are no more, can I know redemption?" All had been taken from the man they called Adagium. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had snatched away his hopes, his future, and the woman he loved. He'd lost everything, all because of that damned stone and that cursed throne. Would that it be gone from this world forevermore. Indeed, he would see it destroyed at his own hands, and along with it, everything else. The gods who forsook men without a thought, the crystal that aided their divine cause, and the whole damn world smeared black with lies. Ardyn longed only to see it all crumble. This was his sole remaining desire. "Come back soon. I shall keep your friends company until you are ready." Your friends. Noctis's face twisted as the words left Ardyn's mouth, his eyes reflecting every single bit of hatred and anger burning within them. And again, Ardyn was struck with a sense of familiarity. He had never experienced the pleasure of seeing such rage in Somnus, but the resemblance really was quite striking. Though his brother and the boy were mirrored in appearance, their personalities and patterns of behavior were night and day, their expressions a study in unending contrast. Okay, I just want to say, I just need to break really quick. So I know Somnus was based off of Noctis, but, like, he looks like older Noctis. Because Somnus is 30 and Ardyn is 33 when all this shit happens. Ardyn is eternally 33. So, like, No, he doesn't look like a 20-year-old. That bothers me so much. I'm sorry. Where they're just like, he looks exactly alike. I'm like, not quite. Not yet. No. He will look similar to Somnus in about 10 years. Give it. Still, the resemblance gave rise to a certain yearning in Ardyn. What a delight it would have been just to see that duplicitous usurper's features contorted in torment just as Noctis's were now. How Ardyn had longed to watch, gaze ripe with malice, as his brother was erased from the world, powerless against fate. He's also a lot bit crazy, so yeah, that's true. Yet despite their endless disagreements and confrontations, not once had Ardyn seen his brother's face like this. The only expressions he remembered were those of annoyance, resignation, and disdain. It was odd. Had he merely forgotten the rest? Had his brother's emotions slipped from his memory with the passage of millennia? Or was there some other explanation? Brother. From deep in his mind, he heard one more voice call out to him. Long ago, when the words of the gods resonated in the hearts of men, 2,000 years before the reign of the chosen king. Whoop. Okay, let me see. Is this proper yet? Yeah, we'll leave it on this. You understand nothing, brother. He had not heard Somnus's voice for so long. The words his brother spoke seemed unusually cold. Willfully you disregard the duties of one charged to rule. No, the chill would have been present for some time already. Anything resembling normal conversation between him and his younger brother had ceased long before then. How many years had it been since he had last heard Somnus laugh? Ardyn grimly curled his fingers to count. As children, they had been close. Between the many hours of study and training, they had enjoyed all manner of diversions together. They were particularly fond of chess. Somnus did not care for the game's prescribed handicap, one piece removed from the elder player's side for each year in excess of his opponent's age. He stubbornly insisted that victory meant nothing if not achieved on equal footing, and no matter how many losses he endured, his resolve never wavered. Ardyn had thought highly of his brother for being so intent, at such a young age, to see justice through. And Somnus was always at his brother's side. No matter where Ardyn went, the younger boy was close behind. So inseparable were the pair that those who encountered either of them on rare days spent apart would jest that they should witness rain falling from a clear sky. But now, no, dear brother, you are the one who does not understand. Propriety be damned. He had to stop Somnus, no matter the means. Why do you give your men leave to slaughter? He challenged. Those they kill are neither beast nor foe. They are our countrymen. Countrymen, Somnus scoffed. What nonsense is this? They are monsters. Leave them be and they'll start a slaughter of their own. You're wrong. They are no monsters. The scourge is but a disease, perhaps a bit vexing to treat, but a disease nonetheless. Though afflicted with the scourge, they are still men inside. The star scourge was indeed particular. Over the past few years, it had begun to spread among the populace. No medical art could cure it, nor could any tonic stem its progress. Those who fell ill were thrust into despair, realizing full well the fate that awaited them. Thus the scourge was greatly feared among the people. Some declared it a curse, others deemed it punishment from the gods. But in truth, it was neither curse nor punishment. It was certainly no retribution from the gods. Of that Ardyn was certain. It was simply a disease. He knew as much because it could be cured, though not with any herb. Their assaults on others are born from the anguish of their affliction, he told his brother. The souls inside remain free from blame. We must simply purge them of this disease before they reach that state. In doing so, we may save those nearby from harm. The scourge brought transformation. The body grew black as jet, and the mind was lost in madness, causing the victim to lash out at anything nearby. Those most firmly in the clutches of the star scourge were pronounced demons and restrained before they were beyond control. Demons were kept apart from the community, and eventually killed. Ardyn endeavored to treat the afflicted, to return them to their former selves, before that happened. I see no difference, Somnus spat. How is it not different? Whether or not a plague is to blame, the fact remains that you alone are able to heal it. Not even the greatest physicians in our land could hope to imitate whatever it is you do. Isn't that right, brother? It was true. For some reasons unknown, the gods had entrusted this healing power to Ardyn alone. Tell me, what can a single man hope to accomplish? Somnus asked. Every life I touch means another soul delivered from the scourge. And as you save one, how many others fall ill? Somnus seemed to taunt him now. 5? 10? Ever will the scourge outspace you, brother. You labor in vain." "No, that's—" Ardyn faltered. "That's not true," he'd wanted to say, but his brother's words stung as such. "What will you do for the towns you are too late to save?" Somnus continued. "When the land is full of demons, will you continue to try to treat them one by one? Better to end them now and stay ahead of the scourge before it brings ruin to us all." "You speak of human lives!" But Somnus smiled in triumph. To him, the argument was already won. Ardyn continued to plead with Somnus, thinking of the men and women he'd seen struggling to hang on to the minds they felt slipping away, terrified by their own disfigured appearances. "They have done nothing wrong!" And they hadn't. They simply bore the misfortune of some malady that had found its way into their bodies. "How can you strike them down when they are free from trespass?" "Ever the dreamer," his brother sneered. "Sentimental hopes do not foundations form. To stand strong, a nation must be grounded in reality." "And so you would take the easy way, the coward's path." Somnus's voice grew hard as steel. "You try my patience, brother. Indulge the people if you must, but I will not tolerate seeing my name and acts besmirched." Ardyn did not respond. He could not. There was murder in his brother's eyes, and for the first time, Ardyn felt his own life might be in danger. A small part of him berated his own ignorance. These notions had clearly been brewing within his brother for some time. How could he have missed it? They were siblings. He should have known the man's mind and temperament better than any other. Somnus would look to any means to achieve his goals. So he had always done. Whatever he set his mind to, he saw it through to the end, no matter the cost. Ardyn realized he had to flee, had to hide. He could not die just yet. Too many lives remained in the clutches of the scourge. They needed his help. He had to keep on living, regardless of all else, until the scourge ravaged their people no more. It was his calling to see the world cleansed. Gonna pause for a drink. My throat's gonna get real sore. I also like their olden speak. Boop. "You look exhausted, my love. Are you all right?" Graceful hands cupped his cheeks, as pleasant as the voice that accompanied them. Their touch was sweeter than the wind that combed through the golden wheat, warmer than the sunlight filtering between the green leaves as Ardyn sat in the shade of a great tree, resting against its trunk. He spoke her name, eyes still closed. "Era." He felt his weariness lift. The haze in his mind vanished, like mist dispelled by the morning sun. True, the seeds of worry still lingered. His last conversation with Somnus had ended sourly, and it was possible to imagine that his life might be in danger. But with Era's hands upon him, he found the determination to go on. He would hold his head high. "Thank you, my love," he said. "But you needn't worry." It was strange. Every time he was struck with longing to see her, she found her way to him. Ardyn opened his eyes. Her golden hair fluttered in the breeze, the light reflecting in her eyes. They were the color of the sea, the loveliest color he'd known in all his days. "I thought that if I waited here, I might have a chance to see you." "I felt the same." Era smiled. Seeing that smile was enough to fill his chest with warmth. But he thought also of the lives that had fallen to the scourge. Each of them were meant to know love one day. Each were meant to have a special someone who made their heart leap, whether their paths had crossed already or had yet to do so. And what a wonderful feeling it was to stand with the one you loved, to face life together, hand in hand. Everyone should have the chance to know that happiness. It was an irrevocable right of life. That was the purpose of the powers entrusted to the two of them by the gods. Her power to heal, or her power to hear and his to heal. Together, he and Era must see that no one lost their chance to know love. "The gods blessed me with a power and a purpose, to cure people of what ails them. I must see their will be done." Ardyn looked down at his outstretched hands. Era laid hers upon them. "Your devotion shall not go unnoticed. The gods will doubtless be watching over you." Somnus had asked what one man could hope to accomplish against the Star Scourge, but Ardyn was not alone. Era was with him, and together they would carry on. "It seems to me," Era ventured, "that the cure for your exhaustion is comprised of two things, one of which is rest." "And the other?" Her cheeks flushed ever so slightly, and a trace of mischief danced in her eyes. "Is me," she finished. Ardyn chuckled, then embraced his love. "Oh, Era," he said, "pray be with me always." At her nod, all his fear was gone. No matter what became of his flesh, he would carry out his calling until the end. No matter what Somnus said, he would not relent. If Somnus thought his words could stay Ardyn, he would be sorely disappointed. Oh no, that is interesting. There's a break, so I'm actually going to read that to chat. Somnus in the Japanese version refers to Ardyn as Anui. It's an old and highly respected way to address your older brother, even after their fallout. Probably to keep up the pretenses in front of people. Although, who knows if that was like, who knows if that was post, like, argument, or no, just when he was the old wall. Oh, when he's in the old wall in modern era. Well, modern era, he's like, I regret everything, and I'm like, cool story, bro. My lord, we have yet to locate your brother. I don't have any images for Somnus. There was like one like CG, and I was like, yeah, sure. So it wasn't like my dislike of Somnus that has no CG for him. It's just or like not CG, but like image of him. But I wanted the concept art really more than the CGs. So yeah, Somnus didn't really have any concept art. So. But this is a Somnus area. My lord, we have yet to locate your brother. However, we continue to scour the area, and Somnus waved the man away, interrupting the report. He'd heard enough. Over half a month had passed since his last argument with Ardyn. His brother seemed to have determined that further talk would be fruitless, stealing away to God's knew where. Irritation, resignation, scorn. Somnus bitterly recalled the final expressions he'd seen cross his brother's face. Ardyn was a man beloved by the people. They would have him as their king, leading their newly founded nation with the favor of the gods. Perhaps Ardyn's anger and frustration were a sign, reflecting feelings hidden in the hearts of the people. However, despite the hope placed in him, Ardyn was woefully unsuited to rule. He lacked the ability to see the world for what it was. He was too trusting, not just of his fellow men, but of the world itself. His eyes were ever fixed upon the good. Admirable, perhaps, but it kept him blind to less desirable truths. Of beauty alone was no man or object sculpted. Kneaded in with the clay were cunning, ugliness, and filth. Was that not why the rule of law was needed? Such dark stains had to be kept in check. Was that not the duty of a king? That's precisely it, he muttered to himself. The quality most needed in a king is a firm hand. To dote upon the people only ensures that the nation shall be forever weak. And a nation had to be strong. It had to be secure. For the sake of its subjects, it had to be ready to repel any incursion. A clan of men gathered in one place did not a country make, but a clan was still all they had, and under constant threat of these cursed demons. Sorry, like I said, I trip over stuff. The promise of safety required troops who were prepared to wipe evil from the world. Somnus was the one to raise the troops, to harden, hone, and lead them. My feckless brother is blind to the truth before his eyes. Ardyn always talked of another soul delivered, saved by his own two hands. But his method would not suffice to save them all. Only some saved meant that many more were not, and in the end, Ardyn's path served only to put the choices of fate in the hands of man. His was the way of one who had never doubted his position in the eyes of the gods, a man in whom all others placed trust and saw promise, a man chosen for everything. To Ardyn, the thoughts of those who had not been so blessed were and would always be a mystery. He would never know how it felt to be passed over in favor of another. He would never know how the forlorn gazed upon the chosen. And you would take the easy way? The coward's path? Somnus scoffed. Why should ease be equated with cowardice? His was the way most just. He would not choose whom to deliver or cast aside from among those touched by the scourge. He would not foster despair and envy in those condemned to a horrid death. No one would be forced to wonder why they had been abandoned when others were not. It was cold, yes, but it was fair. Again, this coming from a man who burned piles of people alive. Cool beans. Somnus stood to leave. Lord Caelum, shall I accompany you? He did not turn, but replied, Stay. I'll not need an escort. The woman he sought would be in the sanctuary, the god's words perhaps gracing her ears at this very moment. Era, the oracle. Era, the woman of his brother's heart. Somnus needed to speak with her, and with haste. He had to ascertain the truth and then plot his course. Somnus clenched his hands into fists. The thoughts hung heavy in his heart, but there was no other choice. It was something he needed to see through, even if it meant dirtying his own hands. I shall not ask forgiveness, he vowed. Nor do I expect to ever receive it. I've been chastised by my mod for my vitriol of Somnus. I need to follow my own rules. Boop. That was a break too, so I'm just going to pause a little at breaks. Far beyond the fields of wheat rose a column of black smoke. Ardyn looked upon it, his expression strained. It was not hard to imagine what was burning there. How could anyone be so callous? In truth, he knew the answer to his query all too well. To Somnus, the innocents burning in the distance were no longer people. Perhaps the man even saw Ardyn as one among the monsters now. It would explain how easily he justified sending men to hunt down and kill his own brother. The previous day had brought another close call. A single night's lodging in a town already cleared of the scourge, and still the soldiers came. Ardyn had underestimated Somnus, and it had almost proved to be his undoing. The younger Caelum seemed to keep watch everywhere. Perhaps no settlement, no matter how small, was safe. Fortunately, Ardyn had seen the dust kicked up in the distance by the soldiers' approach, and he ran. There was no doubt in his mind that had he tarried a moment longer, he would now be in custody, dragged back to the castle like a dog to be thrown at his brother's feet. It was the people's regard for him that kept him unharmed. They'd shown him a safe route, and he'd fled deep into the cover of the nearby woods. Through the dim light beneath the trees, Ardyn ran like a beast hunted, until at last, when his strength gave out and he was unable to push his legs any farther, he huddled in the hollow trunk of a great sentinel of the forest. There he waited for his pursuers to abandon their search. It was nearly dawn before he heard the distant piercing cry of a captain's whistle, and the woods were finally free of soldiers. He continued to hide for some time, huddled motionless in his paltry shelter of bark. Oh, how weary he felt. The past few days had been spent healing several unfortunates deep in the clutches of the scourge, and that had taken its toll. At the root of the plague they knew as the Star Scourge was some manner of parasite. Somehow it found its way into hosts, where it wreaked its havoc. Eventually, the hosts lost their mind to the scourge. Those gone that far were pronounced demons and reviled. But thanks to the blessing of the gods, Ardyn's hands knew how to draw out the root of the scourge. They pulled the darkness from the victim's body and brought it into Ardyn's own. Cleared of the disease, the patients regained consciousness. Their skin, once black as jet and exuding the scourge's dark miasma, would regain its former hue, and Ardyn would carry on, host to another bit of the scourge himself. He was no stranger to the experience of the disease. In fact, he may have understood it more fully than anyone else. In addition to the ability to absorb it, the gods had given him a mind unaffected by the scourge's insidious influence. They had not, however, seen fit to bless him also with the power to cleanse himself. The scourge ever remained, never lessened, simply drawn from him and from others and into him. Each time Ardyn saved another soul, he was forced to accept that pain and suffering as his own. At first, he'd felt no more than a faint malaise, but with time it grew to be a most unpleasant sensation, and then finally a clear and piercing agony. The larger the swarm of organisms within him, the harder they were to suppress. They thrashed about until he thought they might tear a hole through his skin. They felt alive, like some manner of parasite warming inside him. For now, the scourge remained in check, but he knew not whether his body would continue to hold as he drew yet more in. What can a single man hope to accomplish? Somnus's words clawed at his mind. All too well did he know the loneliness of his struggle. How many more victims would he be able to heal before he succumbed? How long would he be able to endure the pain? What will you do for the towns you are too late to save? When the land is full of demons, will you continue to try to treat them one by one? Once more, Ardyn cast his gaze across the fields of wheat, at the smoke of countless lives brought to an end for not more than the misfortune of having known the scourge. First beaten and abused, now they were reduced to ash and scattered to the wind, with no rights spoken over them. Ardyn shook his head. Such atrocity should not be allowed to go unanswered. He had to keep moving forward. There were people seeking his help. He was needed at their side. He tried to rise and leave the shelter of the forest, determined to continue on his way. but his body, riddled with the scourge, would not obey. He pitched forward, unable to throw out a hand in time to arrest his fall. And then he was on the ground, lying with his face in the dirt. No strength came to his limbs. He felt the tiny creatures squirming beneath his skin. It was hard to draw breath. Finally, his vision grew dark, black, the same color as the demons themselves. "Stop, Lord Caelum." Somnus did not reply. He shoved the female attendant aside and put a hand on the sanctuary door. "The oracle mustn't be disturbed. No one must interfere with the ritual." He brushed away another set of grasping hands and pushed his way inside. He knew the precepts. The oracle was here, listening to the words of the gods in the hour of their people's need, and she mustn't be disturbed. He would dare do so regardless. As other lords voiced their support for House Caelum to lead the realm, the gods, too, sought to select a ruler from among the house's men, an absolute sovereign to sit atop the throne of the world's first kingdom. There were 2 candidates. "Lord Caelum, please, you mustn't." Somnus closed the door behind him, shutting out the attendant's shrill cries. Era, kneeling in prayer at the altar, lifted her head to see who had entered. Her expression was a mix of surprise and confusion. "Hail, Oracle." At seeing Somnus, her features hardened with suspicion. Somnus continued, unfazed. "What say the gods?" Era did not answer, so Somnus shifted his approach. "The crystal, then?" "The crystal has no will of its own," she replied, finally, tone flat. Did she intend to evade his questions? Perhaps she could see right through him. Or perhaps the crystal had provided no answers. It mattered not. Neither would impede his plan. "Spare me the nuances of its workings. I only care to hear the message." "Very well. If you desire it, Somnus, you shall have my trust." Her gaze fell upon him, calm and true. Somnus met her eyes. He would not look away. He would deliver his words with confidence, even if they were riddled with lies. "I am to be your brother in marriage. Need I desire to have your trust?" Era's gaze grew more piercing yet. "I am the oracle, tasked with making the will of the gods known." She paused, letting him feel the weight of what might transpire. She had a duty to uphold. The truths handed down by the gods were not something to divulge lightly. "Of that I am well aware. I am not so bold as to defy the will of the gods. However," here Somnus paused, at the point of no return. "No," he thought, "I will not turn back. This is a decision already made." "However," he continued, "my brother's whereabouts are currently unknown. The rift between us is of my own making, and if I do not see it bridged, the god's word shall fail to reach his ears. Surely you know how finding him would aid both my cause and his, as well as your own calling, Oracle." Her gaze had been so sharp he thought it might bore straight into his skull and see the truth buried there. But his entreaty made it waver and fall. Somnus imagined the nights Era spent without sleep, racked with worry for her beloved. The brief moment of uncertainty was all he needed. "I would send for my brother," Somnus announced. "You know he would not come. If my envoy bears a message from the gods, he will believe. He will come." Era's gaze lowered still farther. After a moment she looked back up, staring directly into his eyes. She seemed to have reached a decision. Ardyn awoke. His mind was thick with confusion. He found himself indoors, lying in a bed. The room felt vaguely familiar, and yet not. "Oh, thank the gods, Lord Caelum. I'm glad to see you awake." A young woman peered down at him. Her face, full of concern, jogged his memory. He'd been in this room several days ago. The same woman had lain here, hands and feet bound, growling like a wild animal. She'd been badly afflicted with the scourge, and Ardyn had healed her. "My father and I," she said, "found you collapsed on the ground when we were on our way to town. You can imagine our surprise." Ardyn recalled fleeing from the troop sent by Somnus and concealing himself in the forest. But everything beyond that was blank. He must have wandered around blindly during that time, ending up near the same town from which he'd fled. "You saved me?" he asked. "You give us far too much credit, my lord. We merely loaded you onto our cart and brought you here. Pray forgive us such a crude means of transporting you." The woman's shoulders slumped. Her cheeks, now back to their former healthy hue, flushed with embarrassment. Ardyn remembered their pallor after he'd removed the scourge. It had concerned him back at the time, and he was glad to see her looking so well now. Back then, pale as she was, her parents' eyes still had welled up with tears, overflowing with joy when they saw their daughter's mind restored. That alone had been reward enough. Drawing in the Star Scourge was a small price to pay in exchange for a chance to bring such happiness to others. I owe you a great debt for your kindness. Not at all, my lord, she said with a smile. She'd taught him anew what it meant to help those who suffered. There was no time to laze about in bed. He had to move on. But when Ardyn tried to lift himself up, the world began to spin. Lord Caelum, please, you mustn't. You have yet to regain your strength. There's no time to wait, he said. So many others are out there, still in anguish. And in such a state, I'm afraid you'll be of no use to them. Nevertheless, I must go. I must help the people. The sound of armored boots treading the earth came from outside. The young woman's parents burst through the door. Ardyn needed only to see the looks on their faces to know whose men were approaching. Hurry, my lord, the mother implored. You must flee. Troops from the castle. They're almost upon us. Somnus's men yet again. Ardyn managed to steady himself and rise to his feet. He cared not about preserving his own life, except that his death meant an end to the people's only means of deliverance. He recalled the column of black smoke, and his heart grew heavy once more. He readied himself to face the troops, but the young woman slipped past his side and rushed outside first. What business have you here? She demanded. Lord Caelum is ill. She stood braced in the doorway, arms flung wide, showing no trace of fear despite the soldiers now surrounding the building. Her small frame exuded uncanny courage. No one gets past, she seemed to say, not a step closer to Lord Caelum than where I stand. Ardyn placed a hand on her shoulder and drew her back inside. She reminded him of Era, though physically they did not look the least bit alike. It was the girl's spirit, so like Era's on that day they'd vowed together to deliver their people from the scourge. When he'd seen that resolve in Era, he'd felt that as so long as she were with him, he'd be able to continue, no matter how difficult the journey grew. Your Lord Caelum? The young woman asked. Please, that's enough. You've done so much for me already. He would not burden this household any further. He could not bear the thought of their happiness being stripped away again so soon after he'd managed to restore it. They would not suffer on his behalf, even if that choice meant suffering of his own. But, my lord... I will not forget your kindness to me, he said, and walked through the doorway, each step unsteady. Outside, he caught sight of a banner emblazoned with that all-too-familiar crest. Beneath it stood men in armor bearing the same. He could never have imagined the day would come when the symbol of his own house would signify the enemy. What order had Somnus issued? Kill on sight? Or perhaps he wanted his brother taken alive, to be brought captive back to the castle. The men did neither. Lord Ardyn Lucis Caelum, son of House Caelum. Ardyn could not believe what he was seeing. These were the same men who chased him through the dark of woods one night prior. Now they knelt before him. Last night, the word of the gods was heard. Ardyn Lucis Caelum, you have been chosen to serve as king. A cheer rose up around them. Ardyn realized the villagers had been watching the exchange from afar. The members of House Caelum and their retinues were gathered in the Crystal Sanctuary. All were present, from Somnus and Era down to the lowest-ranked soldier, all in full ceremonial garb. Lord Ardyn Lucis Caelum, son of House Caelum. The ranks lifted their swords in unison. The crowd opened a path for Ardyn as he approached the crystal altar. Somnus, kneeling at the forefront, abruptly stood. That will be enough. The charade stops here. Somnus wore a look Ardyn had never seen before, one he would not believed possible of his stubbornly fair-minded younger brother. I am ashamed to call you my kin, Somnus began. Is there no low to which you will not stoop? You flee and cower in the shadows, then stride back here as if you were a hero. Do you truly covet the throne so desperately? Ardyn was stunned. It was his brother who had sent the men in their message, the same men who had, not a day earlier, been out to take Ardyn's life. Who was Somnus to speak like this? I was merely on a journey to heal the people, Ardyn said. I have no thirst for power. I do not seek control over the land. Then he added, unlike you, dear brother. Ardyn had not once desired to sit the throne. Such power was only a means to an end. If the title of king bestowed the authority to reach more of the people and end all their suffering, if it meant that no one could interfere with his calling, he would take it. That was all. That was why, when he'd been told he'd been chosen, he'd returned home. Ever does that mouth of yours twist the truth in your favor, Somnus spat. A flash of blue, and he stood with a sword in his hand. Ardyn found himself confronted by the gift of blades, as bestowed by the gods upon House Caelum. Weapons summoned at will, now brandished by brother against brother. Ardyn knew he could stay Somnus if he must. The power was split evenly between them. It was me, brother. I was chosen by the gods. Somnus raised his sword high and brought it crashing down. Ardyn prepared to catch the blade with his own, when another voice rang out. Stop! Era leapt before him. Era! He shouted. Her body caught the flesh of steel, and she fell. And to Ardyn's eyes, the whole world was bathed in red. Cold, dark, pain. They were everything. There was nothing else. He was in a place deep underground, one never to be graced with the sun's rays. Thick chains held him fast a dozen times over, allowing him not even the tiniest movement. And beyond the chains, beyond the walls of his stone cell, the sea extended in every direction. There was no escape from this place. Angel Guard, an island long revered by man, a place where the gods used to gather. The tides and the winds pulled strong here, as if they were incorporeal guards stationed to keep mortals away. Days fit for a ship's landing came but for a few times a year, he'd heard. Even if he managed to break the chains and force his way free of the stone, he'd have no means to return to the mainland. Why? For some time after his imprisonment, it was the only question that ran through his mind. I'll read that in a sec. Why am I here? Why am I still alive? He saw the weapons, spear and sword, still lodged in his flank. As they'd slipped in, red blood gushed out, as it would with any mortal man. But the blood stopped far too quickly, and the wounds closed up. Around the steel still lodged in his body. He's become the monster I knew he would be. Somnus's final jeer echoed in his mind. No, the demons were not monsters. They were simply victims afflicted with the disease. That they returned to normal when the scourge was lifted from them was proof enough. To save them, he'd simply had to remove the scourge residing within them. But what of himself? What of the scourge residing in the man who healed others? Filled with far more star scourge for every soul he saved. What would happen to him? So, Maud stops and goes, not to break the moment, but that line, I guess, of Somnus gives me, but it was me, Dio vibes, like the Kono Dio da. I mean, same though. So you're good. I'm not going to ignore a gold comment like that. It's amazing. Ardyn had felt in some vague way that he'd not been able to contain the scourge within him forever. That if he continued to absorb the darkness from others, he'd eventually lose his mind and lash out at those around him. He, too, would one day be a demon. Your devotion shall not go unnoticed. The gods will doubtless be watching over you. Yes, Era, the will of the gods must not be questioned. They work in mysterious ways. Ways which our feeble minds could never fathom. So, too, did I believe. Stop! She had screamed before the blade ended her life. Era, no! Oh, how foolish you were. Why did you lay down your life to protect me? Me, the monster who can never be struck down. Worse for her to still die at the hands of a coward. A man able to raise his sword without a trace of guilt against an opponent unarmed and unaware. How could such a man be allowed to sit the throne? Thus was sown the first seed of doubt about the gods and their ways. When Ardyn held Era as she slipped from the world, as he climbed the altar stairs and reached a hand to the crystal, he'd felt so certain. A man who slaughtered innocent lives was not fit for ascension to the throne, but to be cast down by bolts of judgment. Gods, now is the time to deliver thy wrath. Please let us see your true will. With all his strength he'd prayed. Surely this sacred stone bestowed by the gods would set everything right. Surely it would light the true path forward. It had to. But Ardyn's wish was rejected. The crystal's harsh light knocked both he and Era away. By the authority of the crown, Somnus had proclaimed, I, Somnus of House Caelum, hereby announce the establishment of the new and righteous kingdom of Lucis. Know ye henceforth, anyone who turns their sword against the Lucis shall not live to see another day. I thought there was a yet in there. Ardyn lay crumpled on the ground as Somnus, suffused with the pride of victory, struck him with those words. He did not even think to stand. He couldn't. He lay motionless with no desire to move. If this was the will of the gods, to name a king who massacred his own people at the mere suspicion of scourge, had all Ardyn's labors meant anything at all? See that this traitor is dealt with at once. Traitor? Must you still carry on this charade? It was your plan all along to kill me. So desperate were you to have me draw my sword that you ended Era's life. Somnus had killed her, their devoted oracle, so attentive to the will of the gods, all to see his own mad ambitions through. And still the gods did not punish him. Could the gods truly be so blind? Is the heaven in which I placed all my faith filled with fools? Or was Somnus so cunning that he deceived the gods on high? Had Somnus known? Perhaps his grab for the crown preempted the oracle's revelation. It seemed ample reason to see her mouth forever silenced. But if he had yet to hear the will of the gods, then why the ruse? Era surely would have voiced her upset as Somnus arranged the ceremony, which meant the gods must have chosen Somnus. How had Era felt when she had learned the gods' will? The gods will doubtless be watching over you. No, Era. The man the god chose pays no heed to his people. He thinks not but to sate his own desires. We too will not be watched over. The gods have abandoned us. Or perhaps Somnus had no need to deceive the gods, and they simply cared not at all. Why should a god show concern over life and death among men? The fact that one man alone possessed the power to stay the scourge, or that a murderer sat the throne. Perhaps all such things were but idle diversions to the gods. Was it only for heaven's amusement that Somnus had ascended? Era had died, and Ardyn now spent his days as a monster locked away in darkness? If so, life was a farce. Somnus was out there, his throne more comfortable with each passing year, reveling in his power and doing as he pleased. All the while, his subjects suffered, ignored in the shadows. But what of it if they suffered? What made them worthy of care and protection, that Ardyn should lay down his life to provide for theirs? Somnus's men had looked upon him with eyes full of fear and disgust. Monster, they'd spat as they'd thrust their blades in him with no trace of hesitation. Monster indeed. Doubtlessly even the people whose illness he'd healed would treat him once he turned into a demon. Ardyn the Savior, they'd cheered. Lord Ardyn Lucis Caelum, destined to be our king. Hands that had once clapped for him would now grasp stones to hurl at him and drive him away. It had been a mistake, perhaps, to try and deliver them from the scourge. Maybe everything he'd known and done, from the very beginning, had been an error. Anger festered in him, a kind different than what had ignited on Era's death. This was a quiet rage. It grew bit by bit, threatening to consume him from within, until there came a day when nothing but rage was left. Down here, he would have all the time in the world to brood, to foster his hatred. And if y'all are getting very overtly Christian Jesus tones, yeah. Yeah. That's on purpose. Ardyn's fandom nickname is Trash Jesus. Yeah, my mod said it just as I said that. Or she associates the Marilyn Manson song, Your Own Personal Jesus, with Ardyn now because of it. Especially for me, the Ardyn stan here. Emmy. It's question mark. I just don't know how to, make that. So, Emmy, question mark. Ardyn knew not how long much time had passed, how many years he'd hung in chains. Decades, perhaps. Surely it couldn't have been centuries. Oh, Era, I'm so weary. There is nothing here. No windows through which light may shine. No doors opening to the outside world. Only cold walls of stone on every side. Oh, hang on. Okay. Once Ardyn had been securely bound in his prison, Somnus had sealed up the only entrance with layers of stone. Living on in that empty place, unmoving, merely existing, had grown so tiresome that Ardyn began to yearn for death. It was torture anew, another thing he longed for but would never have. Please, my love, do not let melancholy cloud your face. Yes, I know. You are but an illusion. It is my mind alone bringing such sorrow to your brow. But I'm afraid there is naught else but for me to do here. If only you'd lived. If only Somnus' sword had not found you, and we'd fled to some faraway land to grow old together. No, in the end he'd have suffered all the same. Though she could pass into death, he could not, and the day would come when he held her lifeless form, weeping like a fool. Because he chose to absorb the scourge and bring succor to others, now he hung in darkness alone, in endless suffering for he who sought to end suffering. The greatest of all ironies, all because of the preposterous power thrust upon him by the gods. Forgive me. Era, why are you apologizing? You've done nothing wrong. Forgive me. No, stop. You mustn't say that. Please, my love, I would remember your smiling face. Smile for me, lest I forget that face forevermore. Forgive me. No, why can't I remember? Why can't I call your happiness to mind? That's hardly a surprise. Now it was Somnus' voice. You're a monster, brother. Happiness is beyond you. Curse you, Somnus, begone! Why do you still plague my mind? Foolish woman. Silence! Enough with your arrogance. Enough with your constant disparagement of those you think beneath you. I know you for what you've always been. Do you? And why should a king not look down upon those he rules? The quality most needed of a king is the ability to subjugate. To dote upon the people only ensures that the nation shall be forever weak. Begone! I was chosen by the gods, brother. Me! Why did the specter continue to haunt him? Somnus's was the face he least wanted to see. Everything in this dark prison was but a figment of his mind, so why would his brother not go away? How did he always manage to return of his own accord? You would turn your blade against the king? Yes, he most certainly would. If the king and the gods that named him could be felled, he would most surely do it. But so many years had passed already. Dear brother, he began, you are already dead. He hung for ages in that endless, boring existence. If only someone would come to kill him, to bring an end to this interminable tedium. He'd craved death's sweet release. He wished to be gone from the world, free from the endless workings of his mind. Anyone, I care not who, please end me. If it can be done, end this entire world. I'm so very tired. ME 721. There was a rasping sound, like steel against stone. A slight wrinkle formed on Ardyn's brow. Leave me in peace, he'd meant to mumble, but his throat produced only a hoarse moan. The rasping ceased and silence returned, but only for a moment. Next he heard boots marching across the ground. Dozens of them. No, of course there had been no sound, Ardyn chided himself. It was a figment of his imagination, one among the countless that haunted him every day. After hanging in prison for so long, constantly mulling over the events of the past, imagination and reality had become blurred in his mind, and the line between the two was difficult to draw. On the many occasions he was visited by Era's figure and voice, he was certain he felt her breath and the warmth of her body. Thus the footsteps and the voices they carried were easy to dismiss as a fantasy or a dream. Good, brother, Somnus said. You know your fate well. No man shall ever set foot in this place. I have decreed it so. Still his brother's voice came. Still he failed to banish it or drive it away. Nothing vexed him more thoroughly. There were more footsteps, closer this time. Shouts accompanied them. Watch it! This way! Keep your eyes open! What was all this noise? When Ardyn's gaze drifted upward, lazily, still without any interest, it was met with sudden blinding pain. A stream of searing torture assaulted his eyes. Light. For the first time in how many hundreds of years, no, how much longer still, he was bathed in the uncaring, relentless wash of light. His other senses suggested men present in the cell, surrounding him, but he could not confirm by sight, as his eyes remained squeezed shut against the glare. He's alive, Ardyn heard a laugh, just as the ancient texts told. I'm sorry, I'm no Steve Bloom, so, you know, you're just going to have to make do with this Besithia, not the Steve Bloom Besithia. Of what did this man speak? Who was he? Who? With great effort, Ardyn forced the one word out. Its tenor was unfamiliar. Either his throat had warped with the long years of silence, or, more likely, he'd simply forgotten the sound of his own voice. Suddenly, he was falling face down. The chains and restraints had been severed, and Ardyn, unable to support his own weight, went crashing unceremoniously to the ground. His arms and legs lay limp, unresponsive to his will. Then, in another instant, he felt pain in his chest and flank. The weapons embedded there were being pried free. It was a rough, ripping sensation, underscoring the fact that the blades had become one with his flesh as the ancient wounds healed over. "Take him away." The command came from the same man who had laughed earlier. The order, and its tone, made his position in relation to others clear. Ardyn felt his body rise. Hands gripped him from either side. "Don't touch me," he said. He wanted to brush the hands away, but not a one of his fingers would heed his mind's command. Concentrating every bit of strength in his body, he could still barely manage to raise his head slightly. It was a pathetic display. Still, when his eyes finally grew accustomed to the light, the new angle allowed him glimpses of the men who had brought an end to his isolation. Two carrying him seemed to be rank-and-file soldiers. They were clad in a curious garb, unlike anything he'd seen before, but they carried themselves in the manner of trained troops. Of that he was sure. Somnus would have been long dead. Perhaps the men were under the orders of one of his brother's heirs. From some distance away came another voice, this one strange, somehow inhuman. "Status report." It was accompanied by a crackling noise, like kindling in a growing fire. The noise and the voice's hollow quality made it difficult to sift out the words. "We'll have the medical team ready as planned. There was a noise like distant thunder. Then silence. "Shit! Move!" What the cause for upset was, Ardyn could not fathom, but he felt the men at his sides quicken their pace. The edges of the light at his feet began to blur. Cold crept across the uncovered skin of his shoulders and torso. He gathered his strength and lifted his head a bit higher, now able to see almost straight ahead. They were headed towards a rectangular opening. It was a door to the outside. The outside! He could see it! New sounds echoed from beyond the doorway. Heavy objects colliding with each other. Shrieks of pain. "We knew they'd come. Keep moving forward," the leader ordered, his voice low. Who else was here that this man had expected to encounter? The next instant, the world stretched out around him on all sides. The sky was the color of ink swirling its way through a vessel of water. It might have been dawn, or perhaps it was day and the weather harsh. Still, it felt unbearably bright to his eyes, accustomed to an eternity of darkness. A little farther ahead, several figures stood facing them, clad in black, with weapons held at the ready. At their feet lay several men in armor identical to that of the soldiers at Ardyn's sides. Suddenly, the hands were gone, and he was pitching forward again. He heard the men to either side of him groan as they both crumpled to the ground. Their defeat had come so easily, Ardyn wasn't sure if it was a sign of weakness or their enemy's strength. They were enemies, weren't they? Clearly there were two factions at play here, but Ardyn had no idea which was friend and which foe. He found the strength to rise from the ground and observe his surroundings, more annoyed than curious. One of the men clad in black barked out, "Adagium sighted!" Another word he didn't understand. Get it back in that cell, no matter what." "Ah, they're speaking of me," he realized. "Is that what they call me? Adagium? We can't let that thing off this island." Tiny objects zipped through the air, rushing towards him. Pain streaked through his side. "Stop," he moaned. His chest seared with agony. It was some manner of assault he'd not encountered before, but the pain itself was the same as he'd experienced so long ago. "Cease this," he pleaded. His flesh tore, his guts spasmed. These were sensations he hadn't felt in ages, sensations he desperately wanted to banish from memory. "Cease this at once!" Anger welled up from inside him. He felt the fresh wounds closing. A man with short swords clenched in both hands rushed at him, and Ardyn's arms rose to intercept the blow. It should have been a fruitless defense. Ardyn had no weapon but his bare fists. Instead, he flung his attacker away. The man's body spiraled through the air, sword spinning away in opposite directions. Unbelievable. He really is a monster. In a flash, Ardyn found himself on top of this other soldier, the one who'd called him a monster, and was pummeling him into the ground. He'd heard the insult so many times he ought to have been numb to it, yet at its sound his blood boiled. "Who did this to me?" he demanded. Why did he have this monstrous strength? He had never wished for such a thing. "For what sins must I atone?" Rage filled him, and another man who happened to enter his field of view found himself its target. Ardyn made a fist, into which seemed to flow every bit of anger he possessed. His knuckles drove deep into the man's body. His blood-curdling cry echoed in their surroundings. Then time stopped. To Ardyn alone, the world was frozen. The barren stone landscape of Angelgard was replaced with a new scene, a summer day bright enough to leave him dizzy. Large white boxes were neatly aligned atop of gray earth. Pillars in the ground flickered with red and green lights in curious shapes. It was strange, baffling, and the stranger was still the means by which the images came. He saw them not with his own eyes. They arrived directly into his mind. These memories are not my own. Could they be his? His wife stood beside him, a smile on her face. A small hand clutched his own. He felt another weight and warmth exuded, and the warmth that exuded draped across his back. It was his family. It was the family of this man beneath him. Other memories came in succession. A deluge of scenes. Lucis. Insomnia. The king. Ardyn could do naught but shriek and stare. This man, this soldier, was a subject of the kingdom built by Somnus. The kingdom of Lucis, now ruled by its 112th king, Mors Lucis Caelum, descendant of House Caelum. No, descendant of Somnus. This man belongs to... Ardyn's vision shifted once again. The flood of images stopped, and now, under his gaze, lay the man he'd beaten to the ground. Except he was a man no more. From black sleeves protruded hands equally as black. Diseased skin with which Ardyn was well acquainted, along with the languid black haze he knew it to emit. I didn't purge him of the scourge. I bestowed it upon him, he said to himself in disbelief. He looked down at his own hands. When he'd driven them into the man's body, they'd seemed suffused with anger. He could still feel it. And that concentrated rage seemed to have turned this man into a demon. His mind reeled at the prospect. His entire life, he'd labored to deliver the people from the scourge's grip. Even if it meant becoming a monster himself, every life touched still meant another soul delivered. Now, rather than saving a soul, he'd infected one. Now, his body was a vessel that poured the scourge into another. It was too great a contradiction for his mind to accept. Incredible! Beside him, clapping his hands in a decidedly exaggerated fashion, was the pretentious man who had ordered Ardyn taken from the prison of stone. He seemed to have withdrawn to a safe distance during the scuffle, waiting to see how things unfolded. His power's unbelievable! Ardyn studied the men more closely. His silver hair was carefully slicked back, and his uniform heavily adorned. He was clearly of a different pedigree than the men he commanded. As the man strolled closer, he threw his arms wide. His features maintained a dignified reserve, but his eyes radiated a strange intensity. This was a man to whom morals meant nothing, one of those who dreamt of atrocious schemes and cared not for what price they carried. He was a man of Somnus's ilk, and Ardyn wanted nothing to do with him. Ardyn tried to move away, but found his limbs unresponsive once again. "Hey!" the man exclaimed as Ardyn fell. But his voice was already far away, and blackness closed in on all sides. Remember what I said about Besithia? Ardyn can't fucking stand him. It's because Besithia reminds him of Somnus. Except of the two, I'd actually take Somnus. Like, as much as I don't like Somnus, I'd take Somnus over Besithia. Somnus didn't do crazy experiments. Somnus was a butthole, but he didn't do crazy-ass experiments. I don't know about chat, but I'll take Somnus over Besithia. Also, I love how that thunderclap is Rama being like, "Hurry the fuck up!" Yeah, of the two, Somnus wasn't without any moral compass. Yeah, that is true. That is very true. I need to find an appropriate reaction. There There we go. All right, so this next part is, let me look at the year. Okay, the next year, ME 722. His eyes opened to a familiar vista. Ears of wheat gently bowed in the wind, the field extending as far as he could see. Above them stretched the evening sky. Era stood beneath the outstretched boughs of their tree. Boop, boop. Oh, Era, how I long to see you. The real you, not the pathetic imitation conjured by my mind. How I begged for one more chance to be with you. Come, let us sit in the shade and talk as we used to. There is so much I have to tell you. But as he ran towards her, she was not smiling as she should have been. Era! She was somber, gazing at something over his shoulder. Ardyn turned. Somnus was there. Forgive me, brother, but the throne seats only one. Why do you still go on about the throne? Unless you were never meant to sit there? Stop! A long sword flashed into Somnus's raised hand, and Era threw herself in front of the blade as it came crashing down. Crimson welled from the wound. Ardyn stood frozen, unable to do anything at all. Why? This last whispered word had not come from Ardyn's mouth, but Era's. It seemed strange. Shouldn't he be the one to ask why? But he felt certain that back there in that sanctuary, it had been Era who had spoken that word. What had she meant? Ah, of course, this is a dream, the same dream as always. I've seen it so many times it's more vivid than reality. An ancient tale still unfolding right before my eyes, her body in my arms, growing cold. Gods, no! Era! He awoke with a start. A dream that was all too real was now replaced by a reality that could have easily been a dream. The ceiling above him shone with unnatural luster. The bed in which he lay did not smell like a bed. The room around him was cluttered with furniture. Every object in sight was much too gray and had shapes that were far too straight and uniform. Ardyn rose from the bed, but the strange room did not vanish. I don't have any good, Imperial scenes, so, you're just going to get this really cool piece of artwork of Ardyn cradling Era. Ardyn rose from the bed, but that strange room did not vanish. That alone seemed to prove that this was not a dream. A sigh escaped his lips. Would he never be free from this unfathomable world? Ardyn Azunia. A metallic voice rang out with such perfect timing. He had to imagine its owner waiting patiently for the sleeping man to wake. Ardyn flicked his gaze about, searching for the speaker, but he was alone. Then he remembered. It was one of this world's many devices meant to carry voices from afar. The contraptions had been so absolutely baffling to him at first, but time saw him develop a modicum of familiarity with them. Chief Besithia would like to see you. What drudgery. Of course Chief Besithia wished to see him. The man always did, and every interaction was a chore. Verstael fancied himself single-handedly responsible for waking the ancient monster sealed at Angel Garden and now returning it to the modern world. Worse yet, he now assumed his new pet to be at his constant beck and call. From the moment Ardyn had been carried into the facility, the poking, prodding, and questioning had been ceaseless. He'd have refused had his weary body and mind not deemed resistance to the greater nuisance. I wish he'd give up, Ardyn thought, and leave me be. There isn't anyone I wish to speak with. There isn't anything I wish to do or any place I wish to go. I'd be content enough back in the monotony of that stone prison. He did not, however, make any of those thoughts known. Trying to do so would have been a tedium of its own. Might as well head out. Each footfall was accompanied by a faint, hollow tap. He'd somehow managed to accustom himself to the dreadfully uncomfortable shoes everyone wore, but the clothes still irked him. They cinched at his waist, constricting around him in a way quite unlike any other garment he'd known. Any movement of his arms was accompanied by an unpleasant tugging of the shoulders. He felt restrained, pinned down. As he continued down the hallway, he grumbled to himself, I dare say this outfit wasn't tailor-made. He knew that such comments would scarce resolve his complaints. Such garb was common, even expected, by the people of this year 722 of the modern era. Ardyn passed through a great sliding doorway made of some material even colder than the walls of his ancient stone cell. Just one more strange and off-putting experience for him that, to everyone else in this world, was so regular as to pass unnoticed. unnoticed. The troopers posted at seemingly every door and in every hallway were all clad in the same uniform, faces indistinguishable under the same masked helmet. It made the people, too, seem strange and unnerving, as if they were not men at all, and this place devoid of all life beyond was devoid of all life beyond Ardyn himself. Perhaps that, too, contributed to the ever-present blurring between reality and dream. He trudged through a long corridor until he reached the doors at its end. This research lab of theirs was a place of simple, straightforward design. When he opened the doors, he found a room empty of researchers, save Verstael, who sat stiffly in a high-backed chair at a dining-room table. The man extended a hand without rising, his movements theatrical as always. Repeated exposure to the man's mannerisms and speech had not bred familiarity so much as barely suppressed irritation. "Come, have a seat," Verstael invited. The spacious table was laden with a lavish array of dishes. "I thought we might enjoy a nice chat over dinner." I love how Ardyn, the most extra motherfucker in all of Eos through 2,000 years, finds one other dude to be too fucking much for him to handle. He's like, no, God, you are so extra. Like when Ardyn calls someone extra, holy shit. I love their working relationship because Ardyn was like, I would much rather deep throat and shit a knife than continue to work with you. It just delights me. Sorry, someone's texting. Need to make sure it's not an emergency. Jesus Christ. No, it's not an emergency. Ardyn lowered himself into a seat at Verstael's urging, but he was uninterested in the food. He'd been served countless meals since his arrival, and, as with the garb, he'd found them strange and unpalatable. The things piled atop each plate looked unapologetically artificial. Bread rolls in a nearby basket were the only items he felt certain were edible. Are you not going to eat?" Verstael asked. When Ardyn didn't respond, the man continued unperturbed. "You've been asleep for years. Learning to appreciate the waking world again will take time." Ardyn had no appetite. He saw no reason to force himself to consume objectionable food. After all, he did not risk death for lack of it. "How long has it been since you brought me here?" he asked. 204 days, Verstael responded. "Roughly 7 months or so." The revelation surprised him. Had it really been that long? Ardyn reflected on what had happened since his arrival. Aside from periods spent under observation, attached to the strange equipment that filled the facility, he'd spent a majority of his time asleep. Perhaps that was how the days had passed so quickly. Then again, Verstael mused, the Lucians had you locked away in that prison for nearly 2 millennia. I'd be more surprised if you hadn't lost all concept of time. You must loathe those Lucians for what they did to you, he added. Ardyn gave only an irritated sigh in response. It was not that he did not care, but he had a little need of a lecture on the subject. Verstael had neither ties nor understanding of the matter. Ardyn found his smug air distasteful, and he had no desire for the man's sympathy. "Was your examination of me a fruitful one?" he asked. Verstael and his researchers had poked and prodded to their heart's content. Something better have come of it. "Oh, yes, you've proven far more fascinating than expected. No wonder they kept you locked away. To think the powers of a demon could dwell within the heart of a man. It's incredible." Verstael was all too excited to explain, as if he'd been waiting desperately for Ardyn to broach the subject. "The Star Scourge doesn't sap your life force. It gives you more. Your cells can regenerate themselves, and you can demonify other life forms as well. There's no doubt. You are..." "A monster," Ardyn finished. "Not a monster, a marvel." All a matter of wording, Ardyn thought. Whatever words were used to describe him, it did not change the fact that Ardyn was something other than human. "I can't wait to unravel all your mysteries," Verstael continued. "What is it you want from me, anyhow? What about me interests you so?" Ardyn asked. "We need those powers that you possess. With your strength on our side, we can finally put an end to the gruesome war with Lucis." An end to the war. Put more bluntly, the goal was to see all of Lucis's lands under the Empire's control. The man could never settle for direct expression. "You, too, must desire the fall of the kingdom that cast you into exile?" Verstael seemed to peer into his mind as he spoke, and Ardyn found it incredibly disconcerting. He stood from the table and turned his back on the other man. "My desires are all in the past." Ardyn's reply was curt. When he'd first learned how long he'd spent in the depths of Angelgard, he was stunned. It was no longer an issue of whether Somnus was alive or dead. This world wasn't even aware of what transpired all those centuries ago. The kingdom of Lucis had no record of a man named Ardyn Lucis Caelum ever existing. So what did he stand to gain by dredging it all back up? And even if he'd wanted to, what means did he have to take action? "The man who wronged you may have died long ago, but his descendants still live on to this day. Surely you must bear them some feelings of ill will," Verstael prodded. Ardyn turned to glare at the man in the infuriating smirk he wore. "My feelings are none of your concern." He took no care to hide the scorn in his voice, but Verstael seemed unfazed. Quite the opposite. He appeared to believe Ardyn's response an indication that he'd been right all along. "Come along," Verstael said, rising from the table. "There's something you should see." Ardyn could have chosen to ignore him, to walk away without another word. He couldn't imagine a thing in this world now able to catch his interest. Yet he followed obediently as Verstael made his way down under the facility's other hallways. "I found something most interesting on the rock of Ravito," the chief said. "Something I should see. Something most interesting." The fact that Verstael was able to entice him suggested that, somewhere deep inside, Ardyn still possessed some spark of curiosity. He'd spent 2 millennia locked away on that lonely island. And though the days outside wore on, for Ardyn time had been at an unchanging standstill. It would have been a lie to claim he had no interest whatsoever in the world's course over all those centuries. This way. And many of the objects that filled Verstael's laboratory were admittedly striking. There was a miniature panorama fashioned after the face of the star itself, a thing quite beyond the drawn atlases Ardyn had known in his time. Verstael had called it a model, describing it as how the gods must feel looking down upon our world. On examining it, Ardyn had found Angelgard. The islands where he'd spent 2,000 years in captivity was but a speck, hardly larger than a pebble, in the grand scale of the world. The mainland shore that had seemed so impossibly far away was now separated from the island by just a thin line of blue. All the lands Ardyn had known in his time, his entire world, occupied but a fraction of Verstael's modern map. Aside from the model, there were the specimens, demons harvested for study, and great paintings stretching from floor to ceiling on the laboratory's vast walls that depicted the events of the cosmogony. The displays were all grand, but they never seemed to have visitors to entertain or enlighten other than Ardyn. They seemed to exist largely for Verstael's own amusement. Soon the corridor narrowed and canted downward at a steep slope. Ardyn felt as if he were walking through a giant angled tube. It was a strange, unsettling sensation. "Right down here," Verstael coaxed. They reached a dead end to the tube, and Verstael placed his hand upon the metal surface with a knowing smile. There was a shriek of shifting metal, and the dead end was no more. It was like no door Ardyn had seen before, but it was a door nonetheless. On the other side was a vast, open space. Verstael strode in and stopped, gazing at something beyond and below. Ardyn realized the room was divided in half by a long, transparent wall. He'd seen such partitions in other areas of the facility. Usually they were placed at right angles, forming boxes to house the lab's many specimens, creatures stripped of their flesh, bare skeletons, and other such oddities. This one must have served a familiar function on a larger scale. But there was another type of object he'd not encountered before. Huge cylinders extended at a downward angle from opposite walls. They each expelled a steady stream of white mist. Ardyn drew closer to the partition. Peering in, he discerned a large, human-like shape lying flat on the ground, shrouded in the mist. The shape may have been human, but he'd known no man even half so large. "Is that?" Ardyn began, only to trail off. Verstael grinned. "Ifrit, the Infernian." For a moment, Ardyn thought he'd misheard. The huge figure, however, seemed to be a size befitting an astral. That being that lay there would have no trouble crushing a man in just one of its enormous fists. "You subjugated a god and brought him here?" "He was sound asleep, just like the legend said he'd be, so we put him on ice." After the War of the Astrals, the gods, having used up all their strength, were said to have fallen into a deep slumber. The spot where the goddess of ice lay became a region of bitter cold, the bed of the Infernian a mountain of spitting fire. "Do you think you could turn him?" Verstael asked. Ardyn's eyes widened. Turn a god into a demon? It was absurd, beyond fantasy, something only a madman could conceive of. Versailles continued to probe. You're able to keep the memories of those you demonify, yes? At some point, during the many hours he'd been under observation, Ardyn had spoken plainly of his experience on Angel Guard when the memories of the demonified soldier had flooded into his mind. Perhaps it was a detail he should have kept to himself. If you managed to demonify a deity, you could learn truths no mortal could ever dream of knowing. It's certainly an enticing offer, isn't it? How so? Ardyn asked dryly. You'll access 2,000 years of his memories, and if you can control him, he'll be a weapon of supreme power. Just think, you could exact sweet revenge through divine retribution. Ardyn cut him off. How do you know that is what I want? Revenge? On Somnus's descendants? The very idea was absurd. I don't, Versailles responded, but I know you have no other options. Ardyn did not care. Anger and hatred still burned within him, as strong as ever. But too many years had passed. He was centuries removed from the age he knew. Nothing he did now would matter. Suit yourself. This was not the only thing I had to share. At Versailles' urging, Ardyn proceeded down another corridor. Nothing sparked his interest. Everything was gray and bland and devoid of life. All of it had so little to do with himself. Still, this seemed somehow better than returning to his room. He half listened to the scientist's ramblings as he slowly trailed behind. The bottommost level was a large hangar area. From its size, Ardyn guessed it was used not only to store, but to test the weapons in large mechanized suits Versailles adored so much. It stretched on, several times the size of the room housing the dormant fire god. The ceiling, too, was several times higher, and in that vast space, Versailles' animated voice began to echo, much to Ardyn's annoyance. Do you spend every waking moment thinking about demons? He asked the man. Ardyn had meant it as a jab, but Versailles responded with a broad smile and a deep nod. Aren't they wondrous creatures? I adore their strength. So utterly does a demonified entity surpass the pitiful constraints of a human. I envy you. You envy me? Ardyn asked. A human life is too short to truly understand all there is to know about the world. If my time on this star spanned millennia like yours, oh, the things I would do. Ardyn would have gladly handed over the burden of eternity if he could, but scarcely had the thought formed in his mind before it was disrupted by a crashing sound and the sudden sight of several black shapes dropping to the ground. The intruders rose, and Ardyn knew them for what they were, the same forces that had attempted to intercept his extraction from Angel Guard, the Lucian Royal Guard. Soon more were arriving in the hangar, warping in one by one from somewhere outside. Lucians? But how? Versailles spat, face twisted with malice, but the soldiers ignored him. They moved quickly, surrounding Ardyn. So, you've come to kill me, have you? He asked. It was a question that hardly needed an answer. He remembered the words of those he'd encountered on the island. Get it back in the cage, no matter what. Or die trying, a woman's voice answered all the same. Her features were obscured, and she resembled Somnus not in the slightest, yet suddenly Ardyn found himself staring at Somnus's face. Maybe the association was logical. She was, after all, a Lucian, a subject of the kingdom established by Somnus and watched over by his successors. But it was more than that. Though the weapon she brandished was a far cry from a longsword, her movements were strangely familiar. When she rushed in to strike, he saw his brother's footwork, his brother's hands. Why did she seem like... Because it is me, brother. I'm here, come to kill you. It was Somnus's voice. Again, the same voice that had taunted and tortured him in the depths of Angel Guard. Just as you would kill me, right, brother? Well, I'm afraid to say you'll never know the satisfaction of taking my life. Silence! Ardyn screamed. He raised his arm to block the incoming blade. Pain ripped its way through his flesh, but he did not care. The wound would soon close enough. I'm already dead, and have been for some time, Somnus continued. With a violent shake, Ardyn dislodged the sword from his arm. It went clattering across the floor, along with its black-clad wielder. She still wore Somnus's face. Though I may be gone, my legacy lives in Lucis, his brother taunted. It lives in the minds and hearts of the soldiers before you. Enough of this! Be gone! Ardyn's red blade flashed into his hand, and he slashed at the soldier. From her chest, from Somnus's chest, came a fountain of blood, and then she lay in a heap on the ground. Another Somnus rushed him from behind. While you were lost in slumber, I was busy building a kingdom. What sort of legacy have you left behind, brother? Silence! Away with you! He matched blows with somnus after somnus. Blades swung with such ferocity that it lodged in the floor at his feet and gouged chunks from the walls. Still, his brother would not disappear. "Where's that backup?" a voice shouted, far away and faint. An explosion roared through the facility. The lights went out, but the darkness was momentary, soon dispelled by the glow of red flames spouting through a great hole in the far wall. "Blast! The cooling unit!" Lights from the flames flickered across Verstale's anxious expression. His eyes were wide, and for a moment Ardyn forgot about the soldiers all wearing his brother's face. He followed the researcher's gaze. There was something unnatural about the flames. Pouring through the gaping rent in the wall, they were now scorching the high ceiling of the hangar. They twisted and writhed as if they possessed a will of their own. The black smoke billowed upward, filling the room, and as the flame and the smoke intertwined, they formed the nebulous shape of a giant arm. There was a splintering noise, and the fire spread farther. The giant arm broke through more of the wall, and a body wreathed in flames passed through, landing on the floor of the hangar. In its other hand it held a giant, fiery sword. "He's awakened!" Ardyn finally understood the reason for Verstale's panic. The explosion must have been the sound of the cooling unit rupturing. With the ice melted, there was nothing left to restrain the Infernian. "We must stop him before he destroys everything!" Verstale yelped. There's little chance of that, thought Ardyn. This was a god. Verstale and the others were now dealing with something quite apart from a once human monster. The pyre burner spoke, his words strange and haunting. The language was impossible to parse, but the god's tone was clearly not a friendly one. His giant blade came smashing down, engulfing the floor of the hangar in a sea of flames. In an instant, the Lucians in their black garb were naught but ash. Out of the corner of his eye, Ardyn saw Verstale bolting away, a shrill shriek escaping his lungs as he fled. The fact that he was running at all was a testament to the malevolent man's luck. Ardyn stared up at the Infernian, making to neither flee nor fight. Verstale's earlier words floated to the forefront of his mind. "Do you think you could turn him? Just think! You could exact sweet revenge through divine retribution." With the passing of 2 millennia, Ardyn had thought his lust for revenge had long withered. Somnus was dead. Killing his descendants seemed to serve little purpose. But his mind and heart were at odds. The anger and hatred had never left him. Still they smoldered deep in his breast. That was why the somnus of his mind, the illusion that had taunted him, said the things it did. "My legacy lives on in Lucis. It lives on in the minds and the hearts of the soldiers before you." Somewhere deep inside him, Ardyn longed to see an end to the Lucian line. He was so wrapped up in these thoughts that he failed to notice the motion of the god's flaming hand. It was too late to run. Soon he was in the grip of a fist that could crush a man with no effort. There would be no escape. No matter how much he struggled, he would not break free of this grasp. Ardyn had only one means to resist. Power. He funneled the darkness, the rage, into the palm of his hand. "O Infernian, grant me the power to take Somnus, his people, and his cursed kingdom." The same sensation he felt when he turned those soldiers into demons surged through his arm. The pyre burner's great frame shook. Soon Ardyn felt his own body ablaze, ignited by the astral's unquenchable heat. Yet Ardyn's hold did not slacken. His fingers dug into the deity's arm. "And burn them all to the ground!" The Infernian fell to his knees. "Fool!" The cryptic sounds coming from the astral's mouth began to convey meaning. The words of the gods were no longer a mystery to Ardyn. The hand clutching him slackened, and he was cast to the floor. No doubt the process would take far more time with a god than it would with a man, but the scourge was beginning to take hold. "You dare to subjugate the divine?" Ifrit's memories flowed into Ardyn's mind. He witnessed the moment when man was given fire, and the days when civilization enjoyed the Inferniad's patronage. Solheim dawned and flourished, its technology ascendant. Man grew arrogant. Then betrayal. Rage. The great war of old. The six subsiding into slumber. Beyond that, there were memories of the crystal. Ardyn was fascinated to learn that it not only relayed the words of the gods to the oracle, but also served as a means for sleeping gods to observe the human world. The realization came in bits and pieces as he observed faint images that could not have been lived by the Infernium himself. He saw Era kneeling before the crystal. She wore an expression unlike any he'd known in his countless imaginings at Angel Guard. It bothered him that there was any side to her that he didn't know. "Era!" he called, though she could not hear. The head, bowed in prayer, tipped back suddenly, as if with a gasp. Her face seemed to radiate joy. Her eyes were wide, and her cheeks were flushed pink. When Ardyn caught the image reflected in her pupils, he was stunned. No. How could that be? It was his own face swimming in her eyes. There could be no doubt. Era was seeing his image in the crystal. The meaning was clear. I was the one chosen to be king? The gods had not selected Somnus. Why? It was the last word she'd spoken during that final confrontation in the castle. It had played back endlessly in his mind, a swirling uncertainty that finally made sense. Her final, soft utterance as her life slipped away. The question she'd asked when the crystal rejected Ardyn's outstretched hand. This was what she'd not been able to understand. Why had the crystal turned away the man chosen to be the Founder King? 2,000 years pondering had bestowed upon him some clues. Clearly the gods had, at one time, settled on the man who cared for his suffering people. They'd seen him most fit to serve as king. But as he absorbed more and more of the scourge into his body, he became something other than a man. He acquired the strength not meant for mortals, a power so unnatural that it offended the crystal. Or perhaps it was the scourge itself that the crystal could not suffer. In any case, the choice of the gods and approval of the crystal were in contest. Perhaps it was an oversight on the gods' part. Perhaps they cared so little for man that the error slipped by unnoticed. It was a development not likely foreseen by Somnus either. To him, it must have appeared as a stroke of great fortune. Surely the people assembled there saw what had transpired and deduced that Ardyn had not been chosen. All that would have remained for Somnus was to silence the only other voice aware of the truth. With the oracle gone, there would be no one left to convey the knowledge that Somnus had never been granted the gods' favor. The crystal faded from view, and Ardyn found himself standing amidst a vast expanse of flame. If what he witnessed was the truth, then that meant... It was Somnus's lie that killed you! Era floated before his eyes once more. At some point in his cell on Angel Guard, he'd lost the ability to envision her smiling. Now, too, her face was clouded with sadness. Forgive me. Why do you apologize? It was all a trap laid by Somnus. I defied the will of the gods and revealed to Somnus you had been chosen to be king. No, it was Somnus's cunning. His scheming pried the revelation from your lips. It's my fault. I'm the one who ruined your future. You were deceived, that is all. You've no sins to atone for. But no matter how strongly he objected, she refused to acknowledge his protests, as if even now in death she remained entangled in Somnus's wiles. In the names of the gods above, fulfill your calling, Ardyn, and punish me for my sins. Kill me. Why was she the one to suffer the pangs of guilt? The one who must pay was Somnus, not Era. Somnus was the one who deserved death. Too bad, his brother announced. I'm already dead, and have been for some time. Another Somnus appeared before his eyes, another trick of the mind he could not kill nor send away. This was the man who had deceived everyone, who had killed Era and usurped the throne. No number of deaths dealt to him could ever be enough to see justice served. Yet he would never die at Ardyn's hands. How could such a travesty be allowed to stand? This monster may not be able to destroy you, but I'll see to it that I destroy everything you've built. The nation, the bloodline, he'd destroy it all. Just as the name Ardyn Lucis Caelum had been expunged from history, he'd see to it that Somnus Lucis Caelum and everything connected to him was eradicated. In an age past, Ardyn had believed himself called upon by the gods to save the people. Now, he'd have to kill them. Hear me, O gods above! No longer shall I supplicate you for pardon. Gone was the obligation to obey the gods, who failed to see through Somnus's deception. It was the gods who had allowed Lucis to flourish, who brought no punishment down upon it. No longer shall I sojourn towards the light. Nay, the path I intend to tread is paved with blood and darkness. His faith had been unwavering. He'd lived for the people. Now he saw what a fool he'd been. His faith belonged with no one. He'd seek strength only for himself, labor to see only his own desires fulfilled. And the only desire he had was for revenge. He would agree to Versdale's proposition and aid the man with whatever he desired. It would be a means to see the end of the Caelum bloodline and the destruction of the kingdom of Lucis. No longer shall I seek your guidance. This path is mine to tread alone. As Ardyn thought of Lucis and all the many ways it would be brought to ruin, a great burst of laughter welled forth from deep within him. It was some time before the laughter stopped. And that's how Ardyn went crazy. one of the many, many ways you went crazy. Oh, I need a drink. That was one long... That was one long passage. Who, me or Darren DePaul? Because I'm not Darren DePaul, goddammit. I'm trying to do my best to emulate his tones and everything, but I'm also going to make it something completely my own. Because, I mean, again, I'm not versatile, so, you know, I can't do the Steve Bloom voice. But, like, I'm trying to read it like me and like Darren DePaul did. I'm no Darren DePaul. Oh, my hands. Ah. Oh, that felt good. Oh, my hands. Okay, we've got a chunk I'm headed towards. So we're still going to end in episode Ardyn. And a lot of this is stuff that's already been covered, but I don't know. I like the viewpoint into Ardyn's head. Okay, yeah. Not too much longer. Yeah, Mod's got my back, because... Yeah. Okay, cool. That actually helps, because that tells me exactly where I, Yep, okay. We are... Yeah, I know you love seeing characters going crazy. Okay, we're gonna go to this, because again, we don't have much with the Empire. Just with Ardyn being found. As Adagium. Verstael, is this the man of whom you spoke? Yes, Ardyn Azunia, your radiance. He has proven to be of vital importance to our technological progress. Ardyn kneeled respectfully, his head bowed. An audience with Eoldis... Oh god, I can never pronounce his actual name properly. Eoldis Aldercopt, Emperor of Niflheim, was not a thing granted lightly. Yet the Emperor's gaze wandered aimlessly. He seemed to have little interest in his visitors or their news. Just a short time ago, the response would have undoubtedly been quite different. House Aldercopt had long aspired to see the glories of Solheim restored to the world, and all of its members who sat the throne, Eoldis was the most ardent proponent of Magitech development. Merely a hint of a plan to speed production of their prized new infantry should have been enough to secure his rapt attention. The lukewarm response was likely tied to tragedy. His empress had passed, freed now from the burden of her mortal coil, but leaving her husband alone and despondent. They'd only had one child between them, a boy not yet a year in age, and thus much too young to soothe his father's sorrow. Still, in a sense, Eoldis... Oh god, why do they use his first name? I'm just gonna go with Aldercopt. I'm sorry, it's easier to say. I can say Verstael, but I can't say Aldercopt's first name. Still, in a sense, Aldercopt's despair was quite fortunate for Ardyn. The man was beloved by his people as both being wise and just, perhaps more the former than the latter. He endeavored to rule over the people fairly, but his real talent lay in shrewdly guiding the growth and development of his nation. In other words, he was calm and his decisions were rational. It was a fact that, until now, had been a slight inconvenience to Ardyn. But when a man has lost something that cannot be replaced, his judgment tends to suffer. Reason knows no greater enemy than the sense of loss. Ardyn wanted desperately for Aldercopt to covet more, to greedily grasp for things beyond his means. On that point, he and Verstael were in full accord. The researcher was eager to see more of the Empire's budget dedicated to military expansion, and Ardyn wished the Emperor to grow more bold in his conquests, and thereby hasten the downfall of Lucis. The studies we conduct on the demons bring us great advances in development, Your Radiance. But we are equally indebted to this man for the materials and information he provides. At Verstael's grand introduction, Aldercopt finally deigned to look Ardyn over. However, in all likelihood, he felt less interest in someone of Verstael's recommendation than annoyance with the researcher's incessant talk. Your Majesty. Ardyn stood, interrupting Verstale before he could launch into further address. The scientist shot him an irritated look. This is not, he seemed to say, what we agreed upon. I'm sorry. I live for Ardyn bickering with Basithia. I live for it. It's so good. Pardon my candor, but I wonder if perhaps your Majesty might have an interest in a way to stave off death. Ardyn was taking a chance by disposing with formality, but he decided it was the best way to pique the Emperor's interest. Since his wife's death, the man had undoubtedly been addressed with the utmost delicacy by all who approached him. Stave off death, you say? Aldercopt raised an eyebrow. Hook, line, and sinker. There was nothing more effective than the loss of a loved one to kindle a hatred of death and the desire to cheat it somehow. Very true. Wise and just Aldercopt might be, but in the end, he was still a man. His loss and yearning would drive him to take action, no matter how rash. Yes, your Majesty, in truth, the study of demons and the scourge will open the door to more than just might. It is the key element to discovering the secret to immortality. Ardyn peered into the Emperor's face. He dispensed with protocol altogether. Just think, he continued, a body that cannot perish. That means to reign for time everlasting. Doesn't that sound magnificent? And Aldercop's eyes, until then dull and lifeless, a fire began to burn. ME 725. With the prospect of immortality dangled before his eyes, Aldercopt agreed to most everything that was proposed. Ardyn found it an almost trivial matter to lead the man around as he wished. Ardyn provided the demons, and Verstale conducted the research. The discoveries and inventions were progressing more rapidly than ever before, and soon they were creating myriad new techniques of war. Never for a moment did Aldercopt doubt that the techniques used to fashion weaponry would one day also pave the way to his fountain of youth. So the money kept flowing, copious, to keep the research moving forward. Ardyn had already been installed as a chancellor, which brought him freedom to travel both within the empire and without, along with ample amounts of authority. He urged the Emperor to take an aggressive stance on Lucis. Countless numbers of Niflheim's Magitech creations were sent forth to the front lines, managing even to take down a portion of the wall. Lucis was forced to pull back the barrier back to Insomnia's borders, so that the king could see it strong enough to resist further assaults. The Empire then moved its forward forces to occupy the lands at Insomnia's doorstep, and with those new bases as footholds, Ardyn ventured forth, demonifying the former subjects of Lucis with the scourge, and thus adding to his store of knowledge about the kingdom. The murder of innocent lives brought him no feelings of guilt. The objections and criticisms he'd once cast at Somnus were gone, along with the self that had voiced them. Now, to kill was an act of no great import. He was steadily climbing towards his goal of vengeance, on a stairway built with the blackened bodies of the Lucian people. Hey guys, you made it through 57 pages today. Whoop. Yeah. So, especially on my long day, next time, we'll be able to start our Aeneas part. She starts on page 97. She starts in 40 pages. Next time is ME 734, which, if you were paying attention to your dates during episode Ardyn, that's when Ardyn decides to wreck shit on Insomnia. So yeah, the first one is a bit of a retread of episode Ardyn, but I really enjoy episode Ardyn, and I like seeing the psychology behind him. It also adds a little bit more, because like I had mentioned in while playing through episode Ardyn, he seemed to go crazy really, really, really fast, whereas this let him stew a little bit more. Like, it covered how long he'd been there and how he was imagining Era and Somnus, and it covered parts of the animated prequel to episode Ardyn as well, with Ardyn seeing the burned bodies and running away from Somnus and everything. So it does its own thing and then incorporates things from the game, and the game incorporates things that this doesn't, and Yeah, so yeah, Katie did think he went crazy too fast, but I was just like, I'm just happy there was an Ardyn DLC. And Katie was like, he went crazy too fast though. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. And then the book, she was like, Danny, you're going to like this. You're going to like it a lot because it cements your hatred of Somnus and it shows Ardyn going super crazy. And I'm like, yes to both, please. I will say, like I said in part two, like, yeah, I think it is. My mod was not there to curb me on shit talking Somnus, who I was fighting. When he was like, I knew what I had to do. A sinner could not sit the throne, and I was just like, you burned people alive. But I did mention that in all fairness. I did mention, Mod, don't you give me that angry face. In all fairness, that Somnus had also been played. Because they were all played, as we saw in the end, by Bahamut. They were all played by the Draconian. So, I mean, and like I said, I mean, Somnus is a dick, but between him and Basithia, I'll take him. Somnus at least has somewhat of a moral compass. Basithia is just fucking crazy. And not in the fun way, in the very deplorable way. So yeah, next time we will get to Ardyn wrecking Insomnia, and there will be no Sonic core music to accompany this. But yeah, we will get to that. We'll get to him fighting Regis. We'll get to him fighting Somnus. We'll get to him talking to Bahamut. I did choose the book canon's ending when I played through the DLC, so he does choose to resist fate. But there's some pretty cool imagery in the concept sketches that I like quite a bit. And again, I'm sorry if I'm not on par with Darren DePaul or Ray Chase's or any of the other, voices, line deliveries. You can't exactly be the voice actor. I don't claim to be someone who can imitate such an amazing fucking cast. But I will say this has a little sting at the end that episode Ardyn, the game, did not. And this is what I think sets it apart as the game, like the DLC you play in the game is very much within the game's canon. And this book that I'm holding up that y'all can't see, this episode Ardyn does a really good job at the very end of twisting it to let it fit and slide into the Dawn of the Future AU, which is really cool. Episode Ardyn is a very multi-purpose thing. So yeah. I'm gonna go save my throat now. Oh, this whole book is an AU. Congrats. You get a wish. This whole book is an AU. I mean, it starts at chapter 13. Have a lozenge. Yeah, but it starts at chapter 13, so Ravis is still dead. I'm sorry. I can't help. If anybody listening on YouTube has not looked up the Chocobros reading, there was a prequel that was translated. There was a prequel to the game that was translated, and you can find PDFs and translations of it online. And it's minor things like cleaning Nock's apartment and stuff. So it takes place pre-game. And it was a Japanese exclusive prequel, and some dedicated fans have translated it. Maybe it'll show up in the book that's supposed to come up at my house on Tuesday. So, but the Chocobros did a panel where they read some of those in character. Ooh, it talks about how Gladio got the scar. Ooh, cool. I'm hoping they just tell us more about the family. Like, I want to know more about Ignis's family, because there was nothing about his family. I want to know more about Prompto's. I want to know more about Regis and Ollie, and I want to know more about Claris and Gladio's mom, and more about Iris, and yeah, I just want to know more. But like, fuck. Oh, if you haven't seen the, like, if you haven't looked it up, look up a video of the Chocobros reading the prologue stuff at KupoCon in character, and by that I mean they're in cosplay. So like Robbie Damon is wearing Prompto's hair, and Ray Chase has Noct's hair, and Chris, I forgot his last name, has Gladio's hair, and they gave him like one scar down the eye. They didn't give him the 2 scars because this is pre-Gladio 2 scar. So they gave him Gladio's scar down his eye, and they gave, this is pre-episode Ignis too, and they gave Adam an Ignis wig, and the front part is really floppy. But there's one point where Robbie Damon's like looking over the script, and he looks at he's like pointing at the top, and he like looks out at the crowd, and he goes, "What is Archive of Our Own?" And the audience starts screaming, and I'm like, oh no, he knows. So I feel like Robbie Damon would do the exact same with this book. Just being like, what does Archive of Our Own mean? I'm like, oh no. We've all been caught sinning. Oh, they absolutely do. Yeah, with how he and Ray Chase tweeted each other, yeah, they 100% do. It's so funny. But yeah, anyone listening, if you have not looked that up, look up KupoCon script reading Chocobros in character or something like that. I was able to find it pretty easily. I stumbled across it, and now it's in my favorites. If I remember to, I'll link it in the video description. I didn't remember to link the I didn't remember to link like Leon Chiro or the video of Luna's makeup or anything like that Ray Chase narrated. Like, I didn't remember to do any of that because I couldn't remember what episode it was on because I was doing a mass upload. So, yeah. But yeah, I'm gonna go get some food, drink a mug of hot chocolate maybe to soothe my throat. Maybe some chamomile tea, something nice and warm for my throat. And I will see you guys next time. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening to me read and trip over myself. But I'm excited. We're in the final stretch, and this is a long thing to tackle, but I'm going to do it because this is a fun AU, and I like it. So, thank you so much, guys, and take it easy.